Good morning to John, and good morning to Greg, and good morning to myself, I suppose. Well, it's afternoon. I didn't know how to frame this when I was writing this up, but and also welcome to whoever is joining for the forum on Sunday morning. I'm joined in conversation today by Dr. Gregory Peterson and John Stender. Both Gregory and John are accomplished organists and are in Hastings at the invitation of First Presbyterian Church and Dr. Brett Epperson in particular to help to lead us in worship this morning and to give an organ recital this afternoon as part of the Langenberg concert series. You were aware of that, correct?
Yes, we were.
Okay, good.
Yes, and we're grateful to be here.
Good.
Absolutely.
Good. Dr. Peterson had a distinguished career as a professor at Gustavus Adolphus College. I almost went there. Pacific Lutheran University, Pastor Greg went there. And Luther College, I would never dream of going.
Of course.
But I hear, and my understanding is that it is a truly lovely place to be in the world. Dr. Peterson is also an accomplished performer, having debuted works and performed and toured both nationally and internationally. He currently serves as the Director of Worship and Music at Normandale Lutheran Church in Edina, Minnesota. Dr. Peterson, thank you for being with us today.
You're very welcome.
And Mr. Stender also currently lives and works in Minnesota, where he serves as the Director of Music and organist at First Presbyterian Church of Rochester, Minnesota. In that role, he oversees a thriving music ministry program for all ages and directs the Festival of Music concert series. Holding degrees from Luther College, again, I would never, but I'm sure it's lovely. And Indiana University School of Music, Mr. Stender writes, arranges, and orchestrates music for practical application and has served as a guest conductor, presenter, and performer on a variety of occasions. Mr. Stender, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you. Yeah. It's really an honor.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure for us to have you folks with us. My first question is this. Why do so many organists live in Minnesota? What is it? The hot dish? Is it the wild rice soup?
It's the lovely weather. It's balmy and warm all the time.
Mhm.
Actually, it's getting more that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. We are blessed to have a lot of organists and church musicians.
I mean, it does truly seem that way.
Yeah,
to
I
me,
think
yeah.
so. And I think
Traditional.
some of that has to do with, that big wave of Scandinavian and German immigration in the 19th century and the large numbers that settled in the upper Midwest and in Minnesota in particular. And whether we're Lutheran or Presbyterian or UCC or even the Catholics these days, I think everyone in some way or another is related to the founding of the music department at St. Olaf College by F. Melis Christensen in 1903.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was a genius there, whether he knew what he was doing or not. But the fact that church choirs and civic choirs and school choirs are so prevalent and across the whole spectrum sing sacred music and value it. I think that has a lot to do with why there's so many churches that have thriving music programs and therefore are calling organists and choir directors. Just in our Lutheran community, we meet as a Lutheran community of church musicians once a month for lunch in the Twin Cities, and you can have upwards of 30 people at the lunch, and that's not everybody even who's on the list that gets invited. And people in other parts of the country look at that and go, wow.
What? Yeah.
Close to that. We have to go to a convention somewhere to do that. So
I think it's part of the culture of place too, related to that like everybody in my church choir sang in high school, sang in college. And so there is a concentration of music making at every level. And it's the Midwest in general has long been a place for education, and music has always been an important part of that. And when I was growing up, it used to be that Texas, Iowa, and Minnesota aligned vertically. Those are the states that have big all-state music programs for high schoolers and things like that. So it's a saturation in the culture too, I think, in general.
Yeah. So you're both products of Luther College. I'm a product of Wartburg College. That's why that's the little thing. Yep. And which are supposedly rivals, but they're essentially the same institution, just separated by a few miles. But I oftentimes think about like Iowa and up into Minnesota, you have like you can't throw a stone and not hit a small private liberal arts college that I just have to imagine just produced so many folks who had been involved in music programming in some shape or form. And just all of the little seeds that get planted from all of those places.
The liberal arts colleges, and it's not, Lutherans don't have an exclusive hold on this, but we are derived from, the old quadrivium. I mean, the liberal arts, right, as practiced in the medieval times, and what Martin Luther brought through the academy and how that spread through all of the Reformation. A liberal arts education is still deeply connected to that, even centuries removed. And music was an important part of that quadrivium, and therefore it got brought forward. And of course, our colleges were largely training teachers and preachers when they were founded as well. And so that intersection of faith and learning and where music and the word and music and theology come together, it's sort of a natural outgrowth of everything that we do. Even at this day and age, it's practiced or emphasized differently.
Yeah, this sort of idea that you should have a little bit of knowledge of everything, and even if it's not really your thing, to be able to appreciate it, and to be able to sort of bask in all of these disciplines and all of this sort of way of being in the world. I know that it cultivated a true, or a deeper, I suppose, appreciation of a variety of disciplines in myself than I probably would have had I gone somewhere else. But this is not an advertisement for small private liberal arts institutions.
Next month, I am hosting the Wartburg College organist.
Oh, okay. Karen Black,
Her in Rochester.
I've known since undergraduate college days, actually, and
I was thinking a couple days ago. I'm sure that these folks know Karen Black,
and then he's going over to Wartburg College. He's going to put his feet on the ground.
Lovely, yes.
They have a beautiful chapel there.
Yes,
it's a lovely space. And now you folks may also know Jim Buzza.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Very
cool.
Well. Yes.
Okay, so here we go again.
Yeah.
Jim Buzza's youngest son, Colin, and I were roommates at Wartburg.
Okay.
Yeah.
This makes perfect sense.
It's a small.
There's no escaping.
I know Jim so well.
Yeah.
He was on the worship and music committee where I served in Decorah.
Okay, sure.
As a student.
And Jim and Kathy they've been hospitable to everyone in the world, I think, but as a college student, they invited me to come join their family for Easter when I was stuck there playing for church. And,
that's international students. And,
oh my gosh, yes. Just lovely human beings. Yeah. So we've all, probably been in their living room.
That's right. Yeah.
So, okay. At any rate, we should move along. How's the organ?
Here?
Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's people ask us, students, we were at Brett's choir rehearsal for a little while yesterday on the campus, and, how is it, right? What do you have to do? Is it hard? Is it challenging? And the answer is yes. I mean, as John put it in what he was telling students, by and large, one Steinway piano to the next is pretty similar,
Yeah.
but one organ to the next is not. And so we have a general idea of what an organ like this might be, but until you get in the space, and the acoustics have a lot to do with how you
Sure. Yeah.
hear it and orchestrate it and all of that. But we're finding, I think, that everything we've planned for this concert and for what we will experience together in Worship on Sunday works beautifully on it.
So that's one of the reasons. But I think generally when you talk to folks about the organ,
Yeah.
you open it up a little bit and you show them the guts of the organ. They go, I knew organs were up to something, but I didn't realize it was so complex.
Right.
I didn't realize there was all this engineering and art that went into the building of it. And so that's one of the things we study a lot. Of course, that's why we have to have degrees in what we do. Because like you said, with pianos, there are certain standards that you can count on. And there are standards and there are, tenets of organ building that we can expect and hope for and plan on. But so little is standardized from organ to organ.
Right.
Because each organ is a work of art
made
in the shop of whoever built it. And, they might have had this new innovation they wanted to try. And so they try it on this organ and then it was successful. But they might never use that innovation in another instrument sort of thing. There's a lot of that creativity that goes into it, which is part of the fun and challenge for us to go play different organs. That's why we like to do it.
And the main thing here is that the organ is of a sufficient size and composition that you can do. It has 3 different keyboards for the hands as well as the pedals for the feet. And having 3 keyboards is pretty much expected if you're going to go out and give a concert with kind of a wide variety of music. And so that works well.
Yeah.
Lots of tone, color choices. So it's fun.
Yeah. I had never really thought about, I had thought about each organ being unique in its setup or in its arrangement. I'd never really thought about the interplay between that particular organ and that particular space.
And not only the space, but also the congregation that put it there.
Sure.
And sometimes the congregation that put the organ there, is no longer the congregation that uses the space in the organ. And then changes need to be made to adapt to worship practice and how it's used and why it's there. So we think a lot about that often.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
But the rule of thumb is Olivier Messiaen is as organist, one of our favorite composers to play and listen to. And he is a famous composer. He's also a performer. And he said, that you cannot play a concert on an organ unless you spend at least 10 hours on that instrument.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And when I read that as a student, I read that quotation and I thought, yeah, okay, I could see that. And then I think the next time I went and played a recital after I had read that in a book, it took at least 10 hours to start to feel comfortable with the registration choices. And then, button number 3 on my instrument in Minnesota is where button number 5 is on this instrument. And so there is some muscle memory and choreographing that has to happen. So it takes time.
Organ culture is interesting, and the United States now boasts some of the finest organ builders in the world. The Beatty and Company in Lincoln is one that has built artisan instruments all over. But at the time that this organ was installed here, there were fewer This
Sure.
hadn't evolved quite as much. This
Yeah.
organ is an Austin organ, which it was made in Hartford, Connecticut. So it's also interesting to think about, here we are in the middle of Nebraska, and when this congregation made its decision and a choice on an organ,
Yeah.
it was constructed in Connecticut and it came all the way here. And,
Mhm.
and I noticed down on the organ console that the person who services this organ is somewhere in Missouri.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, it's a small world, but it's a wide world too. And
Sure.
and there's a history and a culture behind every choice,
Mhm.
and including what the Austin Company did and does to this day. So
Mhm. Yeah, I every time that I see someone who isn't Linda sit down to play at that organ, it does seem that they have to learn it all
Oh, yeah.
again, and you can sort of watch sort of the process of
Mhm.
playing around and figuring it out, and what
Right.
does this switch do again,
Right.
and all of those sorts of
Well,
things.
we had that experience preparing. We spent a lot of time registering this morning, and usually the setter button, you hold the setter button and push the piston to save a memory choice.
Right, capture.
The setter button is almost always over
Sure.
here on the left at the bottom of the keyboard. Well, here the setter button is down where your right toe would catch it, and so we both
Took us about
had to
5
spend
minutes
5
to
minutes
figure that
looking
out.
for the button. And
Yeah.
sometimes you have to find the on switch, but
Yeah, once you found it, it's all
Yeah.
fine.
but then the other thing that takes time is that, if it says 4-foot flute,
Mhm.
great, that's great information. That gives me an idea of what I'm listening to. But
Sure.
then you really have to just spend time hearing what that sounds like in the context of the room and against other stops. And so we always talk about registration as though it's like cooking
Mm.
in the kitchen, and you season the food as you cook it. And that's a process. You don't just sit down and go, okay, this is what this piece is supposed to have in it.
Right.
Booyah. It doesn't work that way.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, because not 350 in one oven is not actually
Yeah,
350
exactly.
in
Right.
all of the other ovens.
We call that the Lutheran temperature, but my Presbyterian temperature might be a little different.
Right. Mhm.
Anybody that's used the church convection oven has burned something.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, it is not the same.
Right.
Not the same sort of a thing. There is this sort of like the organ or a particular organ in a place carries with it, I think, a sense of history in a way that, like, the piano that's in the sanctuary does not carry with it the same sort of history that the organ does. And I think that part of that is a result of the things that we've been discussing.
Indeed.
I think that part of it also is a result of the music itself, right? I took a look at the program notes for the recital in the afternoon, and you have music on there that ranges from the early 1700s, I think, maybe earlier, up to 2003, maybe more recent as well.
2023. Yeah.
Okay, so two years ago,
Right.
and there's not a lot of other. I'm not aware of many other instruments that that have that sort of history and whose music repertoire can sort of span that sort of gap. And that's not a gap.
We
That-
know a
that
lot.
distance
Yeah,
Century
as well.
hopping.
Right. Your observation of that would earn you an A in my class.
Okay, that's good.
Which is one of the first things that I talk about with students and
You-
so forth, is
You
that
used to
we
say
are,
the organ is older than the Bible.
well, yeah, I mean, right, I mean, that, or as old, because
Sure.
you do have references in the 150th Psalm, for instance, of
Mhm.
pipes and strings, and but we, in fact, are stewards of centuries
Yeah.
of music. And while it's true that some organists, like some pianists or some violinists or, you know, trumpet players will specialize in one era or another
Sure.
across the spectrum of music history. Most organists do get exposed to and do perform music from the Renaissance on forward. And, you know, the Baroque era, roughly 1600 to 1750, with Bach as at the apex of that, is the sweet spot, right, for organists and a lot of organ music. But what leads up to that and what follows it is equally as important, and you can sort of
It's deep.
trace it all the
Mhm.
way.
Okay.
So that is a special part of.
And then beyond
do.
repertoire, there's a separate tradition, related tradition in playing the organ, but there's a lot of organists who would tell you they're terrified to sit down and play a Bach prelude and fugue, but they would love to improvise a symphony for you. And we know several very fine improvisers. Greg's a good improviser. And of course, in worship, we improvise a lot.
Sure.
Yeah.
Same way clergy probably improvise a lot
Sure.
when you're thinking on your feet and you're, you know, speaking a transition or something like that. Or
you become
when we pray extemporaneously.
Yeah. You become aware of a connection that you hadn't thought of before.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah. So, you know, there's improvisation is like the step beyond all those centuries of repertoire too. And we try to wrap our fingers around all of it when we can.
And you understand, we understand more now the whole arc of how people learned how to play the organ. And since the late 19th and early 20th century, when kind of the Paris school, the Paris Conservatory School of playing the organ kind of took over and began producing methods and all that, a focus on interpreting repertoire or literature became with a technique that could be applied across all of this in some sort of way, became kind of the way we did that. But at the time of Bach and before, the way you really learned to play the organ was to improvise and to do so over a bass line and the proper harmonies that go above that, and then how do you embellish that. And it's interesting to think about Bach's organ music, which we slave over, and we look at her text editions to make sure every phrase and every note is correct according to what was seen in a manuscript. But in fact, Bach would never have played his own music having written it out. He would have improvised it, and it got written out if he wanted to publish it or if students wanted to play it, and he wanted them to play it. And it's amazing to think of these. John's playing one of the famous preludes and fugues on Sunday, and Bach would have just played that, and he would have had the skill to make that happen, and then it would have been written down later, and that's a hugely different process.
Well, and then on top of that, keyboardists are known for improvising in that way, but then singers of that time were capable of improvising harmony in multiple parts as well, because they followed idioms and knew how to improvise cadences and sing polyphony
and add ornaments
just with a bare minimum of leading material. So we've lost a lot of that ability over
that's really interesting for me to hear and to think about, because the organ and the music that we typically hear for it, or I typically hear for it, does seem to be rather devoid of improvisation. But to think about how sort of, which I guess is so reflective of just sort of that general process of invention and creation. Right. Somebody tries a new thing and they think, oh, that was really good. Maybe we should try that again. And then it sort of starts to catch on. And then somebody says, we should probably write this down before we forget it. Right. But to know any skill, to know an instrument that well, to know a pattern, a rhythm that well that you could sit down and say, okay, let's just see what
And
happens.
the Europeans still emphasize improvisation in the training of organists and other musicians. We're like in many ways, right? We're catching up to some of that. Because even at the time that the method books and the teachers like Marcel Dupré and so forth were codifying all these ways of playing the organ and writing it down, and were adapting it. They were still doing both. The French call it a prize, we call it a degree. But you did both. You got your prize, hopefully, in repertoire, but you also got your prize in improvisation. So,
yeah, I always think of improvisation as a jazz thing.
in our country,
Yeah,
that's kind of where
it lives
where it lives most comfortably.
but sure.
But yeah.
Well, and then liturgical style
Yeah.
depends. Some liturgies are more accommodating for improvisation than others. And then when everybody says, well, church needs to be done in an hour, then the music publishers publish
3-minute
offertories that
anthems,
are
right.
2.5
Yes.
and that helps.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how all
it's
that.
all culture.
Yeah, I was thinking about it also sort of connected to preaching style. And you can be a manuscript preacher, you can be an extemporaneous preacher, you can be a 3 notes on a sheet, and I'll fill in, I'll figure out how to get from A to B and B to C as well. So, yeah, interesting. One of my other questions for you then, perhaps related to this, has to do with this idea of sacred music. And how would you delineate sacred music from secular music, or do you delineate sacred and secular music?
Well, there's a lot to say on that topic, isn't there, John?
Well, of course there's. Yeah,
I mean,
it's a good question.
It's a really good question.
When I think of, because I do frequently use the term sacred music, and I do mean something specific by it. I'm thinking about choral and organ music. I'm thinking about scripturally based texted music. I'm thinking about music that was intended for practical use in the church.
Right. It's a thought. Keep it.
And you can talk well about it. But yeah, I mean, popular worship styles try to blur those lines.
Yeah.
And I hear frequently, even from people that do attend churches where the worship is very much band driven.
Yeah.
Contemporary, we don't like that term because all worship is contemporary if it's happening now.
I feel the same way.
But even people that attend a band driven service will tell you, they'll say, well, I want to go to that church because I'm not necessarily someone who wants to go to a traditional service, but at the same time, I want to listen to rock and roll in my car. I don't want to listen to. And so one thing they frequently mention that they miss is traditional hymnody, because that's what they know deep down. And so there are ways in which some of those more modern worship styles try to incorporate traditional hymns, or they rework something and add a chorus or a refrain. And then I always tell people, sure, you might find me listening to an organ recording in my car, but you're going to find a lot of singer-songwriters and rock and roll and folk and jazz. And, I listen to that stuff in my car, but I don't expect to be engaging with that kind of music in church. With the exception of fellowship opportunities where that might creep in.
Well, big philosophical question, right? Is there, or what is the difference between sacred music and church music? Maybe we don't want to answer that right now, but my overarching thought about this, again, goes back to Martin Luther, who was, we believe, said or wrote down, that music was the handmaid of theology, to
Sure.
use that term, and that all music used in the service of, praising God is worthy, right?
Yeah.
Now, some people have taken that maybe too far and said, well, Luther, right, he didn't really, I mean, he used barroom songs and all of this kind of thing. And so we should just do that too, right?
Right, which is
But
too much a generalization.
that's too general. And even the quote that, Luther was reputed to have said, well, why should the devil have all the good tunes? Is probably apocryphal. But I really do believe that. I mean, that music that's created, that's crafted. I mean, so if you take, for instance, an organ piece of Bach that says Prelude and Fugue, what about that is sacred? There's no text.
Right.
It's not based on a Bible verse or a sacred poem. And yet we sort of look at that and go, well, that's sacred music, right? Well, why? Because it was by and large used in the church. Bach would have used something without any connection to a text to set mood or set key in particular before a cantata or something. But that falls under the basic premise that he signed his score as SDG, Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. It's the whole idea that I'm creating this, and under this big umbrella of all music that's used, in the service of God is good. It leaves room for all kinds of different expression, which is a good thing. The difference is that, in some of our denominations, we prefer that even if it's a popular melody or a genre that is more like what you might find in a dance hall or a rock concert, that the text that is used is theologically where we are, right? Rather than, so.
Well, and even in churches where music is very beautifully supported, you might hear things like, well, we're really glad we have a strong music program, but we need to be focusing on Christian education too.
Yeah.
To which I say, well, I'm pretty sure just about everything I do as a musician in churches, that's Christian formation.
Yeah.
And everything we sing in children's choir or adult choir or music we bring on handbells is intended, I mean, it's scripturally based. And, so there's even that distinction gets made sometimes, and it is.
Yeah, it should all sort of be flowing into one another, right, and supporting one another. Right. I mean, I have heard it said, most of the theology that we learned through hymns, or at least I did.
Yeah,
growing.
Sure.
Right. When I don't need to tell you guys this, you put some words with a melody, and it sticks a lot better.
Yep, exactly.
than it
Music
does.
and memory are so closely tied, which is why, right, you probably had experience of visiting the dying, and people can still sing hymns, even in their last moments.
So before I came to Hastings, I served as a solo pastor in Little Falls, Minnesota, for a few years, and I had sort of gotten myself into the habit. I play enough guitar to get myself in trouble. But sometimes when I would go and visit someone who was dying on hospice or some other situation, if I thought that they were likely to not be communicative or not communicative for an extended period of time, I would take my guitar and a few song sheets with chords, and I'd just sort of play through and sing some of the beloved hymns. And sometimes folks would start singing along, or it would just sort of bring a different sort of peace into the room, in a way that music seems uniquely capable of doing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
One of my I have no idea how long we've been chatting. I should have started a clock or something when we started. Um, when you sort of think of the sacred music landscape, however you sort of want to think of that, right? I'm curious what's missing, or what might if we had a little bit more of this, that would be great. It might be, or maybe another way of asking the question is, what do you want to write? Or is there something that you wish someone would write? Maybe for a particular setting or for a particular purpose or something along those. I know it's a really big open question.
That is a huge question. And you know, we had a lot of time yesterday to converse as we were driving down here,
Yeah.
right? And you know, I don't think so much about what's missing in terms of the whole spectrum of what we have. It's more what's missing. In other words, what aren't we using?
Yeah.
Right? This is kind of what we were talking about. There are pieces of sacred music. There are, you know, they're just such beautiful and worthy and deep pieces of music, and yet they kind of get pushed off to the side these days for a fear of, I don't know. But that's where I'm like, okay, there's a lot of things that I don't have anything I feel like I want to write, or that I would even, although I'm thrilled when somebody else does write a new piece, like the one that was written that I'm going to play, you know, on Sunday. But it's more, there's all this wonderful music and we don't hear enough of it.
So can you give an example of something that's maybe sort of been forgotten, or sort of fallen out of fashion in some way?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it depends on where you are, context is everything. But so one of the things that during the Baroque period, and again, it came to its apex in Bach, was the writing and the presentation of a cantata every Sunday, except during Lent and the 3 Sundays of Advent after the first weekend. Some 300 of these, you know, he composed, and there's about 2/3 that remain. And the libretti for these were largely written by clergy of the time and poets. And, you know, Bach didn't write an opera, but all of these pieces they're dramatic pieces that have the conventions of opera, a recitative, an aria, a chorus, an instrumental ensemble. And it's not that they've completely fallen out of fashion, because there are a lot of places around the world, even around our country, where they're done on a little bit more regular basis. But interestingly enough, for being so deeply rooted in the Lutheran tradition, it seems like Lutherans have given up on most of that. And I would love to see some of our collegiate ensembles and even our other ensembles do more.
There are challenges of difficulty. There are challenges of, you know, it costs money to get the resources together to put something on at such a level. Education at all levels matters. And
you have to unpack
perception.
Texts too, right?
But I think that's what it comes down to. I mean, okay, take the cantata cycle, the cycles that Bach wrote. He wrote those to fulfill a specific need in a tradition.
Right.
And I think
part of his job.
I think in church we so often have the conversation based on, well, we've always done it that way. So let's talk about how we're going to allow it to be done now. And I think that's it. It can't just be musicians doing what they do and then them selling it to everyone else. Everyone has to be involved and engaged. And you know, I mean, how many worship and music committee meetings have you been at where the discussion was mainly about candles and needing more volunteers for ushering and greeting? But let's have a discussion about worship and music. what is the music we hear in church today and why? And does it fit who we are and what our needs are? There will always be at any time musicians who are more than willing to fill the air with
Oh, sure.
what's being asked for or what's in vogue. Because you can't stop us from expressing. And so I think that's the key is the mutual engagement about that.
Right.
If you look at like Christmas carols, for example, if you go back through the history of carols, you will see that clergy, poets, musicians, and peasants,
Right. Lay people.
regular folk were involved in the proliferation of and the creation of and the maintenance of
Right.
the popular carols that we now love, wouldn't think of not singing,
Yeah.
Right.
And so that element, I think, is what will lead to the kind of creativity you're asking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And keeping our worship meaningful.
Well, right. And contextual.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the word that's coming to my mind is alive.
Yes. Right.
Mhm.
Being alive changes a part of it.
Mhm.
If you're not changing, then you're really not alive. Or if you're not open to some new thing, then you're really not alive. That just sounds a lot like death. Is kind of what that sounds like.
Well,
but to have that sort of balance of carrying a tradition
Right.
forward into a new day, and being willing as an entire church to sort of continually ask, is the way that we are reading the scripture, is this communicative of God in this day and age? Is in the same way that we would ask, is the way that we are singing hymns communicative of God in this day and age? Is it the way that we are offering a sermon? Or and it's always tricky to navigate those sorts of things, but intentionally leaving space is vitally important.
Yeah.
We said yesterday, tradition
Yeah. So the quote, right? Tradition is the living faith of the dead.
of dead people.
And traditionalism is the dying faith of the living.
Sure.
That's attributed to Dr. Jaroslav Pelikan, right? Who I was fortunate to TA for when I was a student at Yale University.
Lovely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? Did we get it all?
Well, we did. I mean, your question about
Solve
what's
the problem.
missing, I think it gets me thinking about a lot of things, but we balance also. It's what we were just talking about. I mean, where are we in life and what do people need? People need joy. They need space to grieve. They need comfort. They need, and sometimes familiarity is what is
Certainly
covers all of that. When you think about a piece like Handel's Messiah, which most people have some familiarity with, even if it's the Hallelujah chorus only. But in Handel's output too, there are way more pieces that are all like that. It's just we don't do them, we don't know them, and there's a reason why Messiah, rose to the top. I mean, it's absolutely sublime music, and of course, it's the story that we relate to as church Christians, and so
not only as a church musician, but as a ministry professional.
Yeah,
if I can say that. I think about a lot that it's a little too easy to focus on the discussion of the church is in decline, and I think that's kind of a cop out actually, and that gets thrown around a lot. The church is in decline. What are we going to do? Well, the obvious answer is be the church now.
Yeah,
and
the church has changed.
And the pandemic certainly proved too that we are never going to stop needing community and connection and faith in community.
Right.
And so I like to say, I tell my choir members all the time, you don't stop singing because you get old. You get old because you stop singing.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, yeah, and there is a truth to that, certainly. That um, we need things as human beings, and I think as people of faith, that draw us together, right?
Right.
And sometimes that's the potluck,
Oh, yeah.
and and sometimes that's this is a really interesting adult education course,
Right.
and sometimes
A service project,
sure, yeah,
a mission.
yeah, and a lot of times it's the music. This is a thing that
Yeah.
gives us a way to practice. I think uh, sort of giving ourselves away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like sort of giving ourselves to one another,
Sure.
giving ourselves to the Spirit of God, and all those sorts of good things.
Yeah.
So,
And that's also the worshiping body, right?
yes,
We come together as
Mhm.
as the body of Christ to do that, and
Yeah,
that's hugely important still.
yeah, probably. Well, I think I'm gonna just sort of draw us to a close here, real quick. Thank you both for being willing
Well,
to,
thank you
Thank
for inviting us in. This
yeah,
is great.
Yeah.
sit down and chat and experience this weird little room that we have here
I
at
think
the.
would make a nice office.
Yeah.
So, I'm gonna. Do you mind if I close us with a word of prayer?
Love to, yeah.
Loving and gracious God, thank you for the many ways that your spirit is made known. Your spirit of love, of kindness, your spirit of nurture, and your spirit of challenge. Help us, O God, to continue to grow in our love for you and in our love for one another. Help us to continue to learn to give ourselves away to acts of kindness and love and generosity. And thank you in particular for the ways that your spirit is made known through music, for the ways that it has come to us and uplifted us, enlivened our hearts, opened our minds to new depths of meaning and insight. In your gracious and holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.